Okay, welcome. Thank you all for enduring the things you have to endure to go out these days. I am told that the policy of the church is now optional on masks, so be aware and make your choice. But we will begin tonight's program with an opening prayer by our host, Reverend Jonathan Chute, of the Rolling Hills United Methodist Church.
Welcome. Let us gather our hearts and minds in a time of prayer. Loving God, we gather this night in a remarkable privilege of being in conversation and community with persons who are different from us. We look forward to listening, to learning, to discovering how you are alive and at work in all of your children. We ask on this night when so many around our world are broken and hurting one another, that you would work in us and through us to show us the way of peace. We pray in your holy name. Amen.
Amen. Next to Reverend Chute is Rabbi Zeissman, LMU, who always comes last alphabetically, probably all of his life, and we did something to change that tonight. Next is Dean Jihad Turk, Bayan, Claremont, Chancellor Engh of LMU, and I'm Bob Rothman. Welcome all. Tonight's subject, Interfaith, accomplishments past and present. And we're fortunate to have a published author on the interfaith path of Los Angeles. Sitting next to me is Chancellor Engh, who wrote the book Frontier Faiths, Church, Temple, and Synagogue in Los Angeles, 1845 to 1888, and followed it up with, since he had more notes, I'm sure, a paper published in 1997, a multiplicity and diversity of faiths, religions, impact on Los Angeles and the urban West, 1890 to 1940. So continuing that history, we would like for you, Chancellor Engh, to back us up and start at the beginning. And what is the growth interfaith history of Los Angeles, and take the time you need. I think this is important background, establishing a basis for where we are now. Please.
Thank you, Bob, for the introduction, and good to see so many of you here tonight. It's always good to have an audience without masks on, so happy to see you. And thank you very much, Jonathan, for hosting us here in your community here. It's very gracious of you to have us here in this sanctuary. There's no quiz tonight, but I do want to say there's 3 points I want to make when we talk about interreligious cooperation. When we think about Los Angeles and we think about the span of our history, there's 3 general phases that we've gone through. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about where we began, and then how things evolved, and then what brings us up to the present. And then we have other panelists here who are going to take that into greater depth. But when the United States conquered California and took this land from Mexico, Los Angeles counted 1,600 people. It was a very small village. It was a farm community. And if you go down to downtown LA, around the old plaza where Olvera Street is, the community began there because that's where the river was, and that's where farmland was, and it was a farming community. So it was a self-sufficient farming community. There was one church, that was it. It was the Catholic Church there. And so in the early years, as people began coming to Los Angeles, as the people coming in either first in covered wagons and then later on ships coming up the coast, it was a hard city to get to, hard town to get to, because of the mountains and the prevailing winds along the coast. And so it was a slow growth. So the Catholics were here in numbers, Spanish-speaking Catholics, and it was the first groups, the first clergy that came in from the Protestant communities, lasted a few weeks and then just moved on. the big headquarters was San Francisco. That was a jumping off place for the gold rush, okay? So they looked down upon LA as a pretty rough community and not much hope. The first minister that really made some progress was a Methodist minister. His name was Adam Bland. And he came here with his wife, and they wanted to open the first church, the first Protestant church in LA. So the only building available was a saloon. So they set to whitewashing the saloon, and they set up having services there, and his wife taught then a school for young women in the facility. They lasted about 6 months and then said, this is pretty hopeless. There's not much that's going to happen here. So they moved on to San Francisco as well. But he comes back 8 years later and tries again. And in the meantime, different other ministers had come and gone because there just weren't that many Christians beyond the Catholics. The people that were coming in, first came then some of the Jewish community, and then came the Chinese, who were working first on the railroads and then in the farm communities. And so religious diversity began very, very slowly. So in those years, as people, what really changed things when 1876, the first railroad gets to LA. The first time it's easy to get to LA by rail. And then we start seeing other churches emerge very slowly. 1870s, 1880s, the churches began setting up. But because the community was small and because it was isolated, people pitched in and helped each other in their different churches. So when the Catholics wanted to build an orphanage, everybody supported the orphanage. It was the first child care facility in the city. When the Catholics wanted to open a small college, it was the Jewish community that stepped up and started making contributions. And so you had the beginnings in a religious cooperation, because the only way you're going to succeed is if people supported one another. And so the first permanent Protestant church was supported by Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptists, and Episcopalians. They had one church in common, okay? And so as more people came, and as the second railroad came, then it was possible to set up other churches. And so gradually, then you see the proliferation of churches going on. It was not a time, though, when Catholics and got along with other Christians, and Christians didn't get along with Catholics. And so there was a divide there from the beginning. A divide that became stronger as time went on. And as each church got a little stronger, they didn't need to rely on each other so much. And so that Catholic orphanage, which had attracted support from Protestants and Jews and others, slowly became simply a Catholic institution. And then there was a Protestant orphanage set up. And then there was the Hebrew Benevolent Society that took care. Then they began setting up their own operations. And so as the city grew, people began to drift apart. So that first era of cooperation, where people needed each other, began to lessen. And one of the great examples I have is there was a Spanish priest that worked down at the Plaza Church. His name was Francisco Mora, and he was assistant to the bishop. But he was in charge of the money for the diocese, and he wasn't very good at finance. But Isaiah Hellman, a Jewish merchant, was very good at finance, but he didn't speak Spanish. So Isaiah tutored Father Mora in finance, and Father Mora tutored him in Spanish. And so that was just kind of an example of a very simple example of how people helped one another. When the second railroad got to LA in 1885, which was the Santa Fe Railroad coming in, all of a sudden there was competition between the two railroads, and the price of a ticket from Kansas City to Los Angeles went to $1. And people began flooding in, and as the real estate people said, we sell the weather, and we just throw in the real estate for free. Okay, get out of the winter was the advertising. So the LA Chamber of Commerce emphasized, get out of the snow, come to California, enjoy our climate. There's great land here. And so the population began growing, and so by 1900, Los Angeles had grown to the astounding number of 100,000 people, okay? And with that then came in a lot of the stronger feelings in the United States about immigrants and people who didn't speak English. And so you see more of a breakdown. So 1900 to about 1960, you see a greater isolation between the churches, okay, and the religious groups. Okay, nobody accepted the Chinese. Okay, so that's just one piece. So that anybody following Chinese practices were excluded. But then social institutions like the California Club began excluding Jews from membership. It became something that was strictly for white, native-born Christians. And so there was these fractures developed after 1900. And probably one of the most impactful ways of segregation in the city, and I'm going to call it that, what they call restrictive real estate covenants. That when you bought a house, the deed could say, no black can live here, no Asian can live here, no Jew can live here. And then it went down the line, depending on the particular subdivision around the city. So what you have then is not only then distances between people, but the churches aren't even close to each other, okay? And so all through the 1920s, this spreads across the city because LA grows to be over 1 million people, almost 2 million people by World War II, okay? Huge growth of the city, but a segregated city. And so, for example, there was a test case that went to the California Supreme Court. Could blacks be buried at Forest Lawn even if they bought a plot? And they said no. The deed was a restricted deed. So they could own the land, but they couldn't be buried in Forest Lawn. Okay, so this extended across our city until the Supreme Court struck this down as illegal in 1948. Okay, so we had this great division that was taking place. Churches were strong, institutions grew up. The churches founded all the colleges except for UCLA. Okay, so Occidental, USC, what's now Loyola Marymount, Pomona, Redlands, all of these began as church-sponsored institutions. So that idea of supporting one church, everybody supporting one college, diversified over time. What changes, this is the third phase I'm going to mention, and that is in 1963, the Catholics hold a conference, a council in Rome. It says, you know, in light of World War II, we have to be conscious of what Catholics have done to Jews and how we've excluded other religious peoples. It's time to begin conversations. And they passed a document called Nostra Aetate, meaning our neighbors, okay? And so this was the first time the Catholics began to say, oh, we need to be in dialogue with others. The second thing that's dramatically important is in 1965, the U.S. government passes the Immigration Act, which now opens immigration to Asia and other parts of the world. We've been very restrictive on immigration up to that point. And so all of a sudden, we have then thousands and tens of thousands of people coming in from Asia with a great diversity of churches coming and religious beliefs coming at that time. So in 1970, here in Los Angeles, we formed the Interreligious Council of Southern California. So it's the first comprehensive organization that's open to more than just Christians or more than just Catholics and Jews, the National Conference of Catholics, Christians, and Jews. So it begins, and then it's grown and grown, and others have then grown up over time as a consequence of the renewed interest, or I should say the discovered interest of Catholics to interact in with Protestants who'd been meeting together for many years, and now extending that to other religious groups. So if we think about those three phases, that's basically kind of an overview. Obviously, there were people that knew each other, but let me just stop with that and just kind of give you that as an introduction, okay?
Let me ask, is it fair to say, which is often said, that the political controversy or competition in LA was between Protestant and Catholic?
Well, it's very interesting that, yeah, there's always been a political dimension to it, but particularly 1900 through up to 1950 was particularly strong, okay? So it was a Christian-dominated city, but Jews and Catholics were on the outskirts. I'd say, Buddhists and other groups were on the outskirts. It was a very different makeup of the city. So there were very, very few Catholics that were elected, for example, as mayors of LA until Richard Riordan comes along in our own time. Yeah.
Anybody else want to ask a question? This background is fascinating. Is LA inherently, the history different from other cities? In what way? I think you need to touch on that a bit.
Well, that's a very good question. Since Los Angeles grew up really in the 1920s as a real city, we didn't have a long heritage, say, like Boston, where you have established institutions, established churches, established schools, okay? There were customs that were in place in Boston. We didn't have those out here. People came to Los Angeles in those years for a second chance, to get a new start, to change their economic background, to take advantage of what was offered here. And then when you come to the 1930s with the Great Depression, and you have the great flood of people coming out of the Dust Bowl, people looking for an economic second chance. So that then adds a whole nother dimension to what Los Angeles is about, and who's in power in LA and who's not.
I have a quick question. I'm curious to hear the narrative of the evangelical church. I know that the Pentecostal church, for example, has started right here in Los Angeles, and now there are some very large evangelical churches like Saddleback and others here in Southern California. How do they fit into the historical narrative?
That's a great question. If you want to talk about the religious diversity, the Azusa Street revival, which took place in 1906, was actually an interracial gathering of a congregation that experienced what they called the gift of the Holy Spirit. And it began then a movement attracting people to come, because the preacher was African American, the members, there were men and women were preaching, which was, to have women preaching was pretty dramatic change. And so it begins a movement, and that spreads out to other parts of the world, because word spreads from Los Angeles outward, that this has taken out, that this religious fervor has taken place in the city, there are precedents in American history. The Second Great Awakening, for example, in upstate New York and New England, back in the 1820s, 1830s. So we've had religious revivals before. But what's different about this one, though, it was interracial, and it was also that men and women were leaders. And it spreads then across the country. So it's feeding some kind of need that people are not finding in their institutional churches. And then that parallels like other churches that spring up, like the Church of the Nazarene begins here in Los Angeles. The Church of the Foursquare Gospel with Amy Semple McPherson begins here in Los Angeles. And so and then the whole concept, the fundamentalism supported by the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, or Loyola, begins here as well. So you might say it's a religious revival that has many different dimensions that comes to it over time.
It's interesting when you mentioned the Second Great Awakening, the time period of New England, Upper New York State, early 1800s, was also a time of tremendous social transformation. The beginnings of an early industrial economy, the opening of mills, people, frequently women, leaving farms and becoming employed in early factory kinds of settings. And it was in that world that the Shaker movement was born, out of which the Latter-day Saints emerged. So when you describe Los Angeles as this sort of tumultuous mingling of people coming from different backgrounds, it reminded me of that earlier time that the religious and the social transformations were both alive together.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you pointed that out, because when the city grew so fast, from 1900 to 1920, and you have hundreds of thousands of people moving into the city, searching for some place for institutions to identify with and for customs to follow and to set up, a shared community, things are in ferment. Things are in great ferment. And among the, you have to say, if you take a look at that immigration, you have a huge influx of Mexicans coming up, fleeing the Mexican Revolution. You have large numbers of Jews coming from Eastern Europe, fleeing the pogroms that are taking place there. And so the city is looking at city fathers or mothers would be saying, who are these people and what kind of city are we going to have? What's it going to be? Yeah.
There's another interesting nexus I think I'm curious to hear your thoughts on is, given that Hollywood is right here in our midst, what is the nexus between the religious narrative and Hollywood? And just one other interesting fact, when I was doing my doctorate at UCLA in Islamic studies, I was taking a course on the early Christian movement with Dr. Scott Barchi. And, he would oftentimes say that Los Angeles is the most diverse religious community in the world, given its proximity to East and West, and the critical mass of all of the world's religions here is even more pronounced than a place like London or, New York even.
And there's a lot to be said for that, because this huge influx coming in, for which there was no social structure to regulate it or direct it, it put a lot of people on the defensive. Like, how do we guarantee our safety? Like today, when we worry about undocumented immigration, thinking, what are they doing in terms of our schools, our welfare system, et cetera, it inspires fear. And so you mentioned Hollywood. Okay, basically Hollywood is a creation that comes out of a variety of Jewish immigrants coming from the East Coast, many of them foreign-born, changing their names, coming here, but starting over again. Okay, and so they take the Nickelodeons of the East, and then they come out here, and they're escaping Edison's patents on movie cameras. Now, the cameras they use for filming, Edison had the patent, but if they got out here to the West, it was too far for him to catch up with them, so they can make movies here. The weather is a lot better out here, so you don't have to worry then, and you can do a lot of filming outside. So it takes off here, and the entertainment community is enormously important, and a lot of the funding is going to come from the Bank of America, then known as the Bank of Italy. Okay, so there's an enormous connection that takes place then between the Gianninis, who are Catholic, and the Jewish studio moguls, who are Jewish. So interesting collection that goes on there. And so the rabbi at Wilshire Boulevard Temple, known as the Rabbi to the Stars, Edgar Magnan, is then the great apostle reaching out to the Gentiles, okay? But because he has the backing of the studio chiefs, yeah.
Just a quick plug, because Chancellor, what you're describing is so resonant of my family's experience. From the redistricting and when you're describing Los Angeles. So my family emigrated to Los Angeles, to Boyle Heights in the 30s, after the war, 40s really. And Boyle Heights is a really interesting place in Los Angeles. You don't necessarily think of that as being a Los Angeles community. In fact, it was the center of the Jewish community. And there's a wonderful tour guide, this is not a joke, by the name of Shmuel Gonzalez. He's the Barrio Boychik, Mexican Jew, born and raised. In fact, his family from Mexico moved to Boyle Heights in 1895, around then, and his family's lived in Boyle Heights ever since. We take students, Jewish students, Catholic students, et cetera, to visit, and it's an incredible intersection of everything we're talking about: movies, politics, redistricting, redlining, and you get to see in real time not only where Mickey Cohen lived, which I always think is really cool, but a real life history of exactly what we're talking about now.
Yeah. And it's just one little comment I would make is that When Boyle Heights was subdivided by a gentleman by the name of William Workman, he did not put restricted covenants on the property. So that's why Jews could congregate there and not in other parts of the city. There were not restricted covenants. Beverly Hills later would be the same thing, but it did allow these communities to form. Yeah.
Let me add a personal experience about why LA is different from other places. My family, my grandfather, his parents lived in a suburb of Philadelphia, Norristown, Pennsylvania. Recently, now it's been 10 years ago, my cousin's child was bar mitzvahed. It was the 5th generation to be in that synagogue. And because of that kind of oversight and continual relationship, there's a power structure that evolves that does not exist out here because we're all recent immigrants and we don't have that kind of thing going back. So it's much more democratic with a small d in that. Okay, let me move on. Dean Turk, get you involved here. Over the last 60, 70 years, American Muslims have gone from being ignored to taking a well-deserved place at the interfaith table. The journey has not been smooth, and too many Americans remain ignorant of Islam, while some continue to target Muslims with their racism. It's been a goal of Dawn to be a voice for educating our community about Islam as a resource, adding to the bits and pieces generally available from the media. Please give us the Muslim perspective of interfaith progression in America, what has been accomplished, what needs to be done.
I'll tell a shorter story because the Muslims in the United States have a shorter story. Although, we could go back to maybe the 25 or 30% of the enslaved Africans that were brought here were probably Muslim. If you think of Roots and Kunte Kinte, for example, in that book and that movie miniseries, he was a Muslim who was forced out of his faith through slavery, and so because they were unable to pass it on generationally, the African Muslims lost their identity. Although there's been a lot of research now that has dug up some writings, even some books and biographies, and Omar ibn Said in Washington, D.C. area ultimately got his freedom and became a banker and a well-known, well-respected businessman in that area. And PBS did a series or a documentary called The Prince Among Slaves of a literate African. He was a scholar, enslaved Muslim in the South, in Louisiana, who ultimately won his freedom. And so there are a number of anecdotal stories and some research that's been done. But Muslims here in the United States, really, we're about 1.1 million, or 1.1% of the U.S. population, about 3.3 million in number. A third of our community are black, and they're black not from Africa, but from African American, former enslaved Africans who were indigenous to this country for the last 400 years, reclaiming an identity. Think of Muhammad Ali. Think of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was a local here. Speaking of religion in Los Angeles, went to UCLA under Wooden and all of that. Think of, even more recently, people like Dave Chappelle, someone, maybe not the best example of a practicing Muslim, but he ended up embracing Islam. And in part, if you look at the rhetoric of the 1 million African Americans who embraced Islam, a lot of them came from a movement called the Lost Foundation of Islam in the Wilderness of North America, more popularly known as just the Nation of Islam, which was a black nationalist movement. And it was really a response to white supremacy and racism against blacks. And so they developed a theology that was against whites. It had Islam in the title, but hardly any Islam in the content. The theology did not represent the mainstream of Muslim theology whatsoever. It was very antithetical to the core teachings of Islam, i.e., God the Creator is the focus of everything. In their theology, God came down in the form of a human being in 1920, and his name was W.D. Fard, and then Elijah Muhammad was then the Prophet Muhammad. So, it's a very, very different theology. Nonetheless, from the 1934 until 1975, Elijah Muhammad, the leader of that, really had a pick yourself up by your bootstraps attitude, getting people off of drugs, having a sense of self-worth and confidence, and also invested or suggested people invest in businesses. And so they developed not only a newspaper called Muhammad Speaks, but also they had a whole industry selling bean pies, which are phenomenal. If you've never had a bean pie, it's a thing. It's like pumpkin pie, but even better. Look for it, bean pies, trust me. And also fishmongers, that they had this whole national operation, and Chicago was the headquarters, but LA had a huge contingency and several temples here. And when he died in 1975, his son, one of his sons, his name was Wallace Muhammad, or Warthaddin Muhammad, he said, my father, his theology was off, but he did a lot to help the black American community. Those who want to follow me now, after his passing, we are just going to embrace the mainstream of Islam and not have a separate ideology, and not also adopt a racist, anti-white racist theology. And so they joined the mainstream of Islam, and the numbers grew. You might have heard of Louis Farrakhan. Louis Farrakhan originally followed Wallace Muhammad, but then, he kind of went back and picked up where Elijah Muhammad left off. Very small percentage of the Nation of Islam followed Louis Farrakhan, few tens of thousands, whereas approximately a million individuals followed Wallace Muhammad, or Warthaddin Muhammad, who recently passed away a few years back. That is one stream. The other stream, you might have heard mentioned earlier, in 1965, there was a liberalization of the Immigration Act as a result of the Civil Rights Movement. And amongst the Asian countries were many Middle Eastern and Arab and Indo-Pakistani countries, Muslim majority countries. And our policy resulted in kind of a brain drain from those countries. We benefited here in this country from really the cream of the crop of the Muslim intelligentsia, doctors and engineers in particular, and some successful business people came over. About a third Indo-Pakistani and about 25% Arab from a variety of different Arab countries. Syria, Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, etc. Muslims are 1% of the population, but 10% of doctors in America. So 1 out of every 10 doctors in America is a Muslim, because of the number of medical students who came over here and then settled, starting in 1965. So those communities they started to develop sort of a critical mass of Muslims, and then around universities usually, starting in the 60s, and many of them then, many went back and became, government officials and leaders of countries, et cetera, because they had a great education here in the United States. But those who stayed established institutions. First mosques. Now there are 3,000 mosques in the United States. Then they established Sunday schools, then full-time schools, and now we're advocacy organizations helping with civil rights, and a number of other interfaith organizations, community service. There's a hospital that was started, or a clinic that was started in South Central, and then now we're establishing universities. So I'm founding president of the first Muslim graduate school, slash seminary here in the United States, but also, we happen to be located here in Southern California. Sarah Dean's on our board of trustees. So we're now, so in terms of accomplishments, we're kind of plugging into the pluralism, the e pluribus unum that is America, right? Out of many, we are one. And although we come from many different backgrounds, the American Muslim young person is developing a sort of a well-adjusted sense of who they are. And Pew did a survey of American Muslims saying that we're the most ethnically and racially diverse community of faith in the United States. So part of the negotiation that's happening by young people is between immigrant and African American, between Arab and Indo-Pakistani. I mean, my mom's from Oklahoma. She's Caucasian American Christian, Methodist actually. And my father is an immigrant from Jerusalem who came actually before the 60s. He came in 1956 here to California. But many of the parents both come from abroad, and they raise the children here who then negotiate their identity and their participation in society. And so Muslims really appreciate the religious freedom that exists here and are very proud in their identity as American Muslims. And for those who've traveled abroad and seen how the world works outside of the States, when they come back, they really appreciate the way that things work here. And so the image that most Americans have of Islam and Muslims is from the media. And 1/4 of the world's population is Muslim, but the way the news works, what bleeds leads to a lot of, when there's conflict that involves Muslims around the world, and of course 9/11 and other things, that's the main impression. But most Americans don't know their Muslim neighbor, or they don't know that their doctor might be Muslim, or their engineer, not that you have your own engineer, but you know what I'm saying, their colleagues. Maybe they'll see the gas station owner, because a lot of Muslims, a lot of Arab and Indo-Pakistanis, ended up engineering, raising, getting some money and then buying gas stations and 7-Eleven. So yes, that's a cliche, but it's true. I have a friend who owns 100 gas stations. He's Arab, and then another one who's Indo-Pakistani, the same thing. So, but the good news is that Muslims in the United States, given that we have the separation of church and state, unlike the way Islam is practiced in other parts of the world, we actually are allowing the spirit of Islam, which is a beautiful thing that helps, try to elevate our consciousness of God and our morality and our connectedness to our brothers and sisters in humanity, to become a beacon of light to how Islam could be expressed in other parts of the world. So in other words, I'm heading up a university. We are aiming to be a model for how Islam can participate in the world community of faith and of humanity by, in terms of accomplishments, trying to address global warming, trying to establish peace and avoid conflict, et cetera, et cetera. So there are glimmers of hope, and we're hoping that American Muslims here in Southern California in particular, can lead the way on that.
What is the influence of American Muslims on the world Muslim policies? And we see what you say here in the United States. How loud is their voice outside of the country?
So I think, one of the fallacies that you might have heard repeated is that they hate us because of our freedoms, which is really, really the opposite of, and I've lived and traveled all over the world. I've lived in Iran, I speak Farsi, I've lived in Saudi Arabia, I speak Arabic. Every single citizen over there would love to come and live in the United States. They don't hate us because of our freedom. What their challenge is with America, for those who have an issue with the United States, has to do with our foreign policy. Oftentimes our foreign policy is supporting dictatorships or supporting governments that are repressing their population, that don't have good economic policies that support the masses, and that there's a what's the term? The kleptocracy. Thank you. A ruling elite that pillages the resources of countries, whether it's in the Gulf states or places like Egypt, and they're oftentimes military dictatorships, and so the population see the U.S. supporting those regimes, and they get really upset about U.S. foreign policy. But they would love to live where they are with the freedoms that we have here in the United States, because those are human values that we all long for. And so, can Islam be a force for reform in those areas? Yes, in combination with better U.S. foreign policy as well, because we still have sometimes short-sightedness in how we maneuver in different parts of the world, and sometimes our politicians deem it easier to deal with a dictator than a democratic country that might or might not align with our short-term political interests and economic interests. So there's a lot of work to do there.
Once you get outside of individual to individual, things get muddy, don't they? Rabbi Zeissman, you are the Loyola Marymount University rabbi for Jewish students. You're funded by a Jesuit university, and something unheard of not too long ago. LMU also has a leader for Muslim students that they fund. Tell us about your work on campus and how do things go? I mean, tell us what you do and your students, and how are they?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you, Bob, for having me, and it's an honor to be on the panel with the distinguished guests. Reverend Chute, thank you for hosting us. This is very nice, and thank you for coming out and making me feel at home. At a synagogue, no one sits in the front, and so it feels very normal to me. So thank you. When I first interviewed at LMU, I loved telling my friends and family that I was going to go interview for a job. Oh yeah, where? What synagogue? LMU. What is that? What? And I loved looking at the mission statement. And I even remember probably inappropriately saying to who was ever interviewing me, you didn't have to give the rabbi a Jewish version of the mission statement. And they looked at me like you're looking at me now, like, this is our mission statement. And it read very Jewish to me. Read like it talked about social justice and education, and it felt very familiar. So I often joke that I ended up at the best Jewish synagogue up at the Jesuit campus on the top of a shining hill in Los Angeles. LMU has probably, we think about 250 Jewish students. Similarly, we have about 250 Muslim students at our campus. I think I'm doing what any rabbi at the synagogue would do generally. I think normally, or what I tell parents and students, I'm really interested in identity building. Identity building, formation, exploration. I mean, we get the Jewish students that we do get coming to our campus are not all the same. They're coming from different backgrounds, different communities, different experiences. And so to be Jewish to this student is and can be very different to what it means to that student and certainly to me. And so we get to explore what that means. What does Judaism have to offer? How can we make meaning from it in our lives? And that is a lot of fun. I like to do that through Jewish texts and praying and Talmud. Students like to do it through more social gatherings, Shabbat, Jewish holidays. And so we're doing all that sort of stuff. We do a lot of pastoral care for college students, particularly in the past couple of years. With COVID, and there's been a lot of need for the rabbi. Normally, I go to my parents, they need a rabbi, but more and more lately, my 18 to 22-year-olds have needed pastoral support, one-on-ones. There's been a lot more searching. What's going on, Rabbi? Help me understand this, that sort of thing. We do a lot of education in the area, as you can imagine, around anti-Semitism. What is that? What is it? How do you identify it? How can you explain it? What do you do when you see it? We do a lot of education around Israel, Palestine, and what does that mean for us? And how do we engage with our Muslim brothers and sisters or others who may think differently about that? And so we try to wrestle and explore all of those areas. Often and because we're at LMU, obviously we're doing a lot of interfaith. My colleague, Kinan Tawil, the program coordinator for Muslim Student Life, is here in the audience. And we get to have conversations that I'm not sure a lot of people have the opportunity to have. And so I say all the time, we have the opportunity to practice interfaith. I'm someone who grew up in Southern California, Los Angeles. I went to school. My teachers aren't here. I had a really bad religious education. My parents forced me to go to Sunday school. They forced me to go to religious school, mostly because I was going to get bar mitzvahed and then I was going to be done. I went to public school, never learned anything about any religion. And I told this story earlier this evening. When I got the job at LMU, I was amazed at how many people, students, staff, and faculty, said to me, "Oh, I've never met a Jew before," or "I've never met a rabbi before." This is Los Angeles in 2016. And then I started to understand that if I turned it around, it made perfect sense. I had never met a Jesuit. I had never met a Catholic person before, which of course we know is not true, but I could not tell you one thing about the Jesuit faith. And maybe I could tell you maybe one thing about the Catholic faith, but even less about the Jesuits. And so what I think people are saying when they say I've never met a Jew is they don't know anything about Judaism, which is definitely true, I find. And so the opportunity to practice, it's uncomfortable at times to talk about Jesus if you're a Jew. It just is. It's uncomfortable to engage in conversations. A Muslim is a Jew for obvious reasons, political and otherwise. And so the opportunity to practice in a way that you know you're going to fail and say something outrageously silly, which I've done many times, in a way that won't be looked upon as being mean-spirited or dangerous. The opportunity to practice, I find, is one of the things I love about being at LMU. And I'll leave it at that.
Reverend Chute, you are the only one here who has a pulpit, who leads a congregation. Talk to us from that perspective about interfaith education.
It's of deep and long-standing interest with me, though I studied in a theological seminary. My undergraduate study was in comparative religion, and I would say I probably attended a better college than seminary, though I loved my seminary at the time. But I would say that I probably still draw more water from the well of my comparative religion degree than from my graduate theological education. And partly that was because of the character of the program itself, and particularly the chair of that program, a wonderful Canadian pastor named Wilford Cantwell Smith, who did his original theological and religious studies on Islam in India. And it was Islam in India because India had not yet been partitioned. So his work was principally within an Indian context, but studying Islam as a Christian. And he came, founded he was a part of the comparative religion department at McGill, founded the comparative religion department at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, and then founded the comparative religion department at Harvard, where I had the fun of knowing him. And Wilford Smith, it could be rightly said of him that he had forgotten more than anyone else knew in the field, but he really hadn't forgotten very much. When he would speak on Islam, the floor in the front of our lecture hall was full of Muslims who had come to hear him speak. When he spoke on the Hindu tradition, the floor in the front of our classroom was full of Hindus who came to hear him reflect on their tradition. And I so appreciate being in a community that has as much diversity as we have here in Southern California and even Palos Verdes, that World Religions is not studying people who live somewhere else. It's actually learning about your next door neighbor. The program really helped us to address the underlying humanity of our different traditions and experiences, and to call into question the very easy shorthand descriptions and understandings that we have of other religious faiths, or people who are in the practice of their faith. And so, one of the ways that we look at religious traditions is we say, well, there's a human figure, frequently a man, and a book. We have Moses in the Old Testament. We have Jesus in the Christian Bible. We have Muhammad and the Quran. And he would help us to see that for Christians, the Word of God is actually Jesus Christ. And the Bible is the thing that points to the Word. It is not itself the Word. The Word is what became flesh and dwelt among us. To correlate to Islam, book and human, is actually to make the wrong identification. In Islam, the Word is the Quran, and Muhammad is the one who points to the Word. So he would call into question those kinds of easy correlations that we tend to make. And the other thing that he had that I still draw from was a searching honesty. When in a general survey course, we covered a wide range of different traditions. And he would focus on one tiny aspect of a tradition in order to sort of spend a lot of time on it. In the study of the Jewish tradition, we spent one day on the expression, he hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. We spent 2 hours on that. When we studied the Buddhist tradition, we spent 2 hours on the meaning of the hand positions of the Buddha in Buddhist sculpture. He would just drill down on one thing. When he covered Christianity, that was when he covered religious evil, because he could do that confessionally. He could talk about our shortcomings and our failures rather than sort of pointing out everybody else's wrongs. And so that has certainly been a part of my formation and has stayed with me and helps me when I hear people saying things that are easy and sound like they make sense, to ask the question, does that really have any currency with the people for whom it's meaningful? Is that how a Muslim would see this? Why don't we ask one? Rather than thinking that we know all about what they believe. And here's one little tiny other gem that I remember from that wonderful teacher. The word Hindu is derivative of the Indus River. People in India in the 1800s did not practice Hinduism. There was no such thing. it hadn't been invented yet. It's a creation of Western scholars who went to India and observed what people were doing, and out of their own institutional understanding of what it meant to be a religious practitioner, said, oh, those people all believe in Hinduism. That was not something that actually meant anything to a Hindu. And so even today, I still bridle when I hear people saying something about Hinduism. I think that would be like someone coming to North America, observing what we all do in our diversity, and calling it Americanism. And then say, well, how do you believe in Americanism? Well, none of us understands it that way. But after about 100 years of Western scholarship and institutional formation in India, there are now people who believe that they are practitioners of Hinduism. It's a phenomenal, wacky world that we have lived in and that we sometimes create for ourselves. But we can do better than that.
Western man does get fairly arrogant in looking at other cultures and trying to say, we do this, so this must be their equivalent to what we do, when it really has no relationship at all. We're good about that.
Bob, I just wanted to pick up on a theme that I heard that I found very inspirational and present here in Southern California as well. So I served as the imam and religious director of LA's oldest and largest mosque. And by oldest, I mean all the way back to 1952. I was not the imam, I was not the founding imam, but we're kind of the new kids on the block. So now there are over 120 mosques here in Southern California, but I served as the imam there from 2005 until 2012. And while I was there, I was approached by the former dean of USC's library science and then president of Claremont School of Theology, Dr. Jerry Campbell, who came to me in 2009 and said, well, first of all, he asked me to give the invocation at their commencement speech, which I thought, you know, I'm a Muslim, are you sure you got the right person here? And he said, yes, I'm doing it on purpose because when USC became secular, and we were the school of religion from 1902 to 1956 at USC. And when USC became secular, as did a lot of the, as you said, Yale, Princeton, Harvard, you know, all of the schools here started out as seminaries and then some of them became secular. They spun off, they moved out to Claremont, and they're technically incorporated as Southern California School of Theology to this day. He said, we became ecumenical. And ecumenical, for those who are uninitiated in the room, means various kinds of Christianity, talking Catholics and all the different mainline Protestants. Usually not evangelicals, though, but, you know, and not actually so much Catholic, but different kinds of mainline Protestants, I think. But he said, now we want to expand the tent a little bit in the spirit of Moses, right? And become interfaith. And so he said, I need your help. I said, well, what can I do to be helpful? He said, we want to reclaim the role of religion to be a force for peacemaking in the world. And we want to do that by having as the core seminary experience for our Christian students a training in understanding our Muslim neighbors, our Jewish neighbors, our Buddhist neighbors, et cetera, by desegregating theological education. Not by watering it down and not by changing what it is we teach, but by doing so as a consortium. And he said, can you, and I said, well, what can I do to help? He said, well, can you identify an accredited Islamic graduate school seminary for us to partner with? And I said, well, that's easy. There doesn't exist any in the entirety of the United States, let alone here in Southern California, but we need one with the growing number of mosques, et cetera. Less than half of the mosques in the United States even have an imam. And 90+% of those imams that do exist were born, raised, and educated abroad, which means that they, although they might come with an authentic teaching, are ill-prepared on, you know, as you're focused on at LMU, identity formation of the youth, let alone inclusivity of women in leadership and in community, because some of them come from cultures that are more male-dominated. We could use some women on this panel as well. I'm just putting that out there, but because we do have incredible Muslim women leaders. But so I said we need one, and I happen to be an academic by training and a religious leader by experience. I think I can, rally the community together, and we can create one. And he says, great. If you do that, we'll help you in 3 ways. We will share our campus, the 16.4-acre campus there in Claremont, just north of Foothill. Our library, our admissions office, the whole classrooms, everything. I said, that's great. He said, we will also incubate you so that your programs will be accredited from the beginning, but we want you to be authentically you. You choose who to hire, what to teach, et cetera, because we want to be in a real conversation. And we want to allow our students to cross-register so that they will learn about Islam and Muslims from your faculty and your students from our faculty. Not to convert, but to understand, have the common ground, and build on that something beautiful. And he said, there's more. And I said, well, what more could there be? He said, we'll give you the startup funding for the first couple of years. And I said, well, that's very Christian of you, Jerry. He said, well, we have a trustee who's very excited by that, and he'll put up the startup funding. So we launched 10 years ago. We announced it in 2010, and we have now grown about 44% a year on year for the last 10 years. And so it's a really exciting partnership that is truly, and we have here Dr. Reinhard Krauss, who's taught at Bayan courses in interfaith engagement, Abrahamic faiths in conversation, a number of times for us. And he also has taught it at UCLA, but he's taught it for us at Bayan, and he's led interfaith trips, and he's a leader in his own right. But it's really been a phenomenal experience. And part of what we bring isn't just the religious diversity, but because we are so ethnically and racially diverse as a Muslim community, 40% of our student body are African American. And we have this mix in the classroom that's just so incredible. And I remember last summer, one of the students was commenting that there was a summer course offered on the Quran, and more than half the students in the class were the Christian seminary students, and it just opened up so many different facets to the study of the text with their involvement. So I just wanted to share that anecdote. It's LA. I think that's a quintessential LA story. We did recently change our affiliation to Chicago, so we're trying to spread out the beauty and the blessings of Los Angeles nationally. But and now we're affiliated with Chicago Theological Seminary, but we do have a debt of gratitude here in Southern California to Claremont School of Theology.
Father Engh, LMU has been a leader in interfaith work going back a long time. I once did some digging in the university archives and found that in the 1960s there was a proposal floated to make what was then Loyola University into 3 colleges, Catholic, Protestant, and a Jewish one. Many Jewish attorneys have Loyola Law School degrees on their wall because Loyola Law School was the only one in Los Angeles that didn't have a Jewish quota. The Martin Gang Institute was established at Loyola University as a partnership between the university and the American Jewish Committee in the 1950s to teach public employees and members of private sectors cultural understanding of their neighbors, of pluralistic Los Angeles. So it's certainly been a multicultural, multi-religion campus for many years, and I'd like to hear you comment a bit more about how that works.
Okay. We're going to step back just a moment from what we're really fascinating what you're talking about in terms of the development of the Muslim institution here in Claremont, and then going off to Chicago as well. Bob's referring to in the 1950s, Because of the divisions that existed between the churches and religious groups, the American Jewish Committee approached Loyola to set up this interracial training center. And they were partnered with the National Conference of Christians and Jews as well, which is another part of the story. Because LA had these great divisions, they realized LA had to do something to train people. And so the idea was the Summer Institute would train police officers, would train teachers, and would train business leaders in terms of interracial relations and interreligious relations. In that first group in 1953, there was a very disgruntled member of the LA Police Department who was thinking about leaving the police department because he found it such a difficult experience to be an African American in the police department then, and that was Tom Bradley. And so it was in that training period that he first discovered there were Jews and Christians who were interested in treating others fairly in terms of abiding by the law, and in terms of desegregation. And so that program went on for a number of years and became what they called the Martin Gang Institute. Because the proliferation of other organizations, and that's like the Interfaith, Interreligious Council of Southern California and other organizations, the need for this diminished at Loyola. And so many other places brought it up. So we had a long history of that cooperation between the Loyola and the Jewish community. There were those who were leaders of the Catholic Church who were not so interested in interreligious dialogue. Let me just leave it at that, okay? And Loyola could do that because it was independent of the Archbishop, and they could do that at the time. I'm really curious, in light of our conversation tonight, what do we see as the challenges that face us today? Because Loyola was involved then with the American Jewish Committee and the National Conference of Christians and Jews. What's our challenges today, and who works on that today to bring us together? I'm just really curious. I mean, a conversation like this is really terrific, but I'd be just from your different perspectives, I'd be really interested in hearing what people have to say.
I just want, we'll add, moving into the 21st century, the Academy for Jewish Religion, a seminary, Jewish seminary that ordains Jewish rabbis and cantors, just recently moved on to Loyola Marymount's campus as a continued partnership in this ongoing partnership we've been talking about. So the idea that, the opportunities that speaks to, I think, are immense to continue bringing together people and learning from each other. I'm no future teller, but, I would imagine one of our biggest challenges is identity. So there are more and more nuns, not the way you might be thinking about it, but NONESs on our campus, people who identify as having no religion or spirituality. When they check off the list, they're none. And so, working with a 18 and 19-year-old who has identified as no spirituality at a Catholic university where I'm the rabbi can present a challenge. I think there's actually a lot of opportunity and blessings there, but I think that's what I think of as one of our biggest challenges.
I would say that a gathering like this is helpful, but I would also say that even within our own congregations, there is much diversity of religious and theological thought and experience as well, and that even if we were just genuinely to listen to the experiences and the insights of other people in our congregations, we would possibly be having interfaith conversation. Things that we think that everybody takes for granted or assumes as what it means to be a United Methodist, a Protestant Christian, a Roman Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, are probably things that maybe don't have a lot of currency within and among our flock. I remember many years ago being well, really, really surprised. A couple that I dearly loved, who are now in conversation with God in more direct ways than in this life, shared with me, these were persons who you would think of as religiously and theologically and politically conservative in general, just sort of across the board. But they shared with me their heartfelt and deep conviction that the love of God and the issues of justice and injustice in this life were so irreconcilable that the only way that they could imagine something that would make things right was with the notion of reincarnation. And I remember thinking, I know they didn't learn that here. But I also thought it was their well-intentioned appropriation of an understanding of how the universe works, which in the traditions that do understand reincarnation as a part of that process, view it negatively. That is, for Hindus and Buddhists, the idea is not to get to come back. The idea is to not have to come back anymore. But for them, it was borrowed and made a part of they were here every Sunday. So I just think interfaith conversation is something that we possibly can't avoid, but we really, really ought to be open to and appreciate listening to each other's deepest hopes.
With as an American Muslim whose name is Jihad, I kind of feel like a walking teaching moment. And on the one hand, I want to answer the question and say, oh, it would be great if there was greater understanding and, there were more forums like this, et cetera. But I almost want to flip the question on the head and not say, well, what challenges do we face as our communities, but rather, what are we doing as communities of faith to address the challenges of society? What are we doing to address homelessness? What are we doing to harness the incredible power of our, gathering spaces, our mosques, our churches, our synagogues, our universities? What are we doing to harness the incredible spirit and talent of our congregations to, face out into the world and make this world a better place? Tikkun olam is the mantra, to borrow another Hindu expression within Judaism. But the idea is, what can we do collectively within our congregations, but also across the religious divide, to try and make this corner of the world in which we live a little bit better. And I really think that in terms of the nuns, the next generation that define themselves as spiritual but not religious, what they're really saying is, I haven't really found meaning and fulfillment in organized religion, but I still feel like there's a connection to humanity and a higher power. I'm not finding it fulfilled in the ritual of congregation. So what we really have to do is say, okay, let us figure out how to present religion in a way that's meaningful and relevant to young people, and I think that involves making the world a better place. And I would just say that, I'm encouraged by the number of people from our community that are becoming civically engaged, that are establishing charities and hospitals and clinics, and that 10% of the community that are Muslim physicians are establishing clinics all over the country. We established 2 here in South Central Los Angeles in response to the uprising, in the 90s. The Muslim students at medical school at UCLA said, what can we do to be part of the solution? And so they started the University Muslim Medical Association, Ummah, which means community clinic. And now they have a branch at Fremont High School, and they're doing incredible work. And this is before Obamacare, and when there was no insurance and no safety net, et cetera. So, even Sarah Dean, she's civically engaged, running for, the local school board here. young people are starting to plug in, and if we can just give them that spark and encouragement and support, I think that might be part of the challenge that we face collectively.
That same student who says none will have a completely religious experience doing yoga or at the concert or hiking through the woods, and as long as you can, find a way to meet that need or that meaning, I've found that the other thing I was listening, a lot of my students, when I say, what do you want to do Jewishly when you leave this school, or as an adult, like, well, I'm not going to be a rabbi. And I say, well, you can live Jewishly as an actor. You can live Jewishly as a doctor, and it could look any way you wanted to, as long as you're bringing good and menschlichkeit and into the world. And so, anyway, that's something I thought of.
Sometimes I wonder if our emphasis, which is so strong on political correctness, keeps people from saying what they really want to say. I mean, are we becoming better people as a society, or are we afraid to say the things that used to be said before? How much of each is in this? Nobody else is concerned about that? I am.
Bob, it's both. I mean, there is an opportunity for us to share genuine respect, interest, engagement with each other, and there is a long history of people misunderstanding, misappropriating, and paving over other people's experiences, and those are both operative at the same time. And so there are people who are afraid of saying the wrong thing, possibly because they don't know anything about it, or because they're aware of just how tender and easily wounded people can be around their deepest beliefs. And then there are those who are not worried at all and charging right ahead, and then we get the fun of trying to pick up after that. But I think certainly both are operative. I think we're growing in understanding and respect for each other, and we're also a little flinchy and hesitant.
We've all heard the joke about the two Jews and the three opinions. So I won't mention that because that's too easy. But I tell students all the time when I lecture, and it's time for Q&As. I say, guys and gals, this is the time to ask the question. And I always say, please, the more offensive or the more out of bounds or the more silly, the better. You can't offend me. I have 3 young children, but it will lead to an honest conversation. And so that's one thing that I always lead to students. It's really hard for them to ask the question, although sometimes I'll get a brave student who comes to me one-on-one. But that's why I go back to education and practice. The more that you have the opportunity to practice these conversations, the less that fear of saying the wrong thing goes away. And I say even more importantly is what's important to you. What's important to you as a Jew? And then at those conversations, it may be a little bit easier to not go into the traps.
I was going to make one comment that as we come out of the pandemic, I think we have to recognize everything that we've been through in terms of it's been trying, it's been exhausting, we've had tremendous losses, and there's a certain amount of just collective exhaustion that I notice in the school in particular when students are hypersensitive about certain things. It says to me, they bring to the campus what they experience at home and in their community, and so they're tired and it's been tough, and we have to figure out a way how we can be of assistance to help people heal and recover as we come through the pandemic. I just think we can't pretend that everything's just fine and we've made it. I think there's a lot more to it, and we haven't even plumbed the depths of that. And I think because there are those who desire to be spiritual, they're looking for ways to feed their spirit and heal their spirit. Yeah.
Questions? Sure.
While he's making his way over, one thing I always say to young people in response to I'm spiritual, not religious is religion, when done right, is spirituality plus community plus some self-discipline, and which helps you not just in good times, but when you're facing stormy weather. It gives you a deep keel so that you don't tip over. So religion, when done right, is spirituality plus those other two benefits, self-discipline and community.
I've truly enjoyed the humility that's bringing you all together on the stage, but I'm going to ask an out-of-bounds question, perhaps. When you're a minority, you often feel alone, and you look at statistics a lot. So while Muslims are 1% in the United States, in LA County we're 2%, and Buddhists are at 2%, and Hindus are at 1%, the religious landscape of the country is changing pretty rapidly. We have folks reclaiming indigenous traditions. Where do you guys see opportunity, and where do you see challenges? And I'll be a little bit more specific. If we consider expansion of these tables and bring in groups that are beyond the Abrahamic religions, is there more to lose than there is to gain, or vice versa? Thank you.
Let me answer the last part of that. When we started Dawn, we approached the Eastern religions to join us, and they declined. So we did make an effort in the beginning. Anyway, who you want to?
I will only say that I think that extending the umbrella and the tent as wide as possible. I think always the opportunity to hear stories, for me, I've learned, helps me understand people. And so one of the best ways I've done that is to be in community with people from that community. So I mean, there's never a yes or no. It's never black or white. But I think extending the tent to include as many people as possible, in my experience, is better than not.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Jonathan and Rabbi and Jihad and the Chancellor. As a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I wanted to follow up what Jonathan mentioned about the Great Awakening in Western Pennsylvania, and then the movement of the members of our church across the United States and coming to California. And I'm related to an individual who joined a group called the Mormon Battalion in Iowa. And they walked across the United States to San Diego. And they were some of the first members of our church to come to San Diego and to California. And then they moved up along the coast, came to Los Angeles, and then they were with the group that dug the mill race at Sutter's Fort. But their leader said, you don't want to mine for gold, you want to come back. And they gathered in Utah. But then in the 1930s, the leaders of our church said, we really have to move outside of the state of Utah. And they bought the Harold Lloyd estate and the Harold Lloyd studios on Santa Monica Boulevard. And World War II stopped them from building a temple, but now, of course, in 1954 it was opened. So I think that members of our church have been very involved with interfaith work throughout Southern California. And what Jihad said, I was so interested because our church does have the Howard W. Hunter Chair at Claremont, and Professor Bushman and his wife were here for a number of years, and they were great theologians, and now we have people following them up. So I think that as we look at this landscape, I think it's very interesting to see how this interfaith group and the people from our church have been involved. Thank you so much.
Anyone have a question? Another one there.
Bob, behind you.
Hello, everybody. I've often heard that organized religion needs to be watered down a little bit to be more inclusive and get more people involved. I found that the more somebody knows about their religion, the more open they are to be interested in somebody else's. I'd like your comment.
I think that's true, Pat, at our best. If you know your own tradition and faith deeply, it gives you a place to relate to the depth of someone else. If you're just sort of a spectator in your own religious life, you don't really you don't really know enough to know them either.
Yeah, I'll speak from experience. You know, having led a very large congregation for many years, we started. I served as the vice chair of the Interreligious Council back in the day, and the president of the Wilshire Center Interfaith Council. But we did two really interesting projects that didn't just bring the leaders together like those organizations, but brought the lay people together. One we did with all of the different Christian denominations, and one we did with all the different Jewish denominations. So the one with the Christian denominations, with the late Dr. Gwen Gabord, the two of us co-founded something called the Christian Muslim Consultative Group, which is not a catchy name. We were not marketing people, but we did bring together all the different Christian, the judicatory representatives, meaning the official representatives of the different denominations, and the various large Muslim communities, and including different sectarian groups, Shia and Sunni. And we developed a study guide that paired up lay people from mosques with their neighboring churches. And we launched this nationally. And it's called the Standing Together Study Guide. Because Gwen came up with the name because she observed us in our prayer. We stand shoulder to shoulder in prayer. And even though we're all individually praying to God, there's a symbolism of we're also unified at the same time. She says, well, let's stand together. And so we did that, and some of the congregants were a little bit, hesitant. Am I going, if my son or daughter participates, or if I participate, am I going to lose my faith? Am I going to somehow? What they found was that they learned more about their own faith in the course of answering questions about their faith, and they deepened in their connection and their commitment and then their identity, spiritual identity within the faith. So it's actually borne out in that group, and then also with the Jewish community, we did something with the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding where we did a twinning or a pairing between mosques and synagogues. And the Islamic Center, given that we were very involved in interfaith, we paired up with the Wilshire Boulevard Temple, we paired up with Bashir Shalom in Santa Monica, we paired up with a conservative temple, the largest this side of the Mississippi, I believe, Valley Beth Shalom, yep. And then also with a modern Orthodox, which, mostly Orthodox, they don't do interfaith, but modern Orthodox and at B'nai David, we partnered, and we've been in deep relationship ever since. And we talk about all of I just had my uncle who lives in Jerusalem, and he's a photojournalist for like Reuters and AP, talk about his experience living under occupation to an Orthodox, modern Orthodox community whose children are in the IDF and all of. It was a very raw conversation. They invited him as a result of these deep relationships and interpersonal connection. So not only are we, no one's losing their faith in this process, but I always say interfaith relations are about the relationships. And an incredible bond can be formed because we see the humanity of each other, and we're all trying to become the best self through our religious practice. And even though we have distinctions between how it is that we practice, we still appreciate, we share the same values, and we appreciate the commitment that each person has towards that journey of becoming a better person.
Okay. Bob wants me to be quick. I agree with what the question is and what you said. I'm both Jewish and Christian. And on my way to become a Christian, I said, if I first have to learn more about Judaism before I can become a Christian. That's an experience. The question I have for you gentlemen is, you're all from the liberal side. Why isn't there in this group someone from the evangelical, more conservative side? All the interfaith discussions I've been in, and I love discussion to people that represent their religion, they all tend to be open-minded. There's hardly a person who is not open-minded. That's one question. The second question is, quick. Second question is, I love talking to Catholic priests. I find them to be intelligent, open-minded, sympathetic. I told my Catholic friends I have these relationships with Catholic priests. They are surprised that that is what I find in them. They see a different person than I talk to. So how do you get the more conservative voice in, and how do sometimes ministers and rabbis talk to the congregation the same way they talk to me?
So, Larry, I can take the first one, which is that it is hard to get people interested in engaging in interfaith conversation when they do not believe that those are worth having. And so within American Christianity, the more conservative fundamentalist among us believe that interfaith work is not worthy. It is antithetical to the practice of proselytization and conversion. It is a waste of time. It's a pleasant diversion that they don't believe they have time for or inclination. So when the Dawn Unity Group was first forming around the Kristallnacht commemoration, they absented themselves from the community that was working to bring the event together and the conversations that have flowed from that since.
And I can answer the question about the priest. No, I'm just kidding.
Here in Los Angeles, there's been an evangelical Catholic dialogue for a number of years between the Archdiocese of Los Angeles and then with particularly people from Fuller Theological Seminary, which may not be the most conservative of the evangelicals, but it is representative. And so, in fact, one of the priests that I live with has been on that dialogue for a number of years. So at least at a scholarly level, there's a dialogue that has been going on. How is that transferred to a congregational level? That's a whole other issue, yeah. And that's part of what we're talking about, yeah.
I have a experience also with interfaith work in one of the largest evangelical communities here in the country, but it's located here in Southern California. Surprisingly, one of the pastors from Saddleback came into my office at the Islamic Center of Southern California a number of years ago and said, let's begin a conversation. And I was very surprised by that, but I pursued it. Long story short, we did have a number of gatherings that were large at the church in which we, talked about our common reverence for Jesus, because Muslims believe in Jesus as the Messiah. You probably didn't even know that. That's a whole nother gathering, by the way. But we had those kinds of conversations. But ultimately, the work of that pastor, and there are many pastors at Saddleback, not just Pastor Rick, when news broke about our conversations, the partnership, the engagement ceased, and there was like disavowing that had ever happened in public forum. So, there was a lot of pressure that they were facing by their own congregants, accusing the pastor of being, of promoting Chrislam, some kind of watered down version of Christianity, et cetera. So they've faced a lot of pushback amongst their own congregation, and so it's just not a ripe environment as Jonathan was suggesting. Yeah.
Thank you all. We will be in this very place once more on April 24th, when we will talk about Jesus through Christian and Jewish lenses, which will be educational for all of us. And now it's interfaith cookie time, so thank you all for coming.